Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Holbrook again, talking about U.S. Latin American relations. Today, I'm going to talk about the transition in the 19th century, from basically the middle of the 19th century to the end and the beginning of the 20th, of a transition from what one author calls hegemony to imperialism. So let us begin. So we have a timeline here. 1845, John L. O'Sullivan wrote an article in the New York Morning News in which he coined the term manifest destiny. It was the manifest destiny of the United States to extend from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Of course, and that was just before the Mexican-American War, and at the time he wrote this, it was difficult for the United States to extend to the Pacific because California stood in the way. The U.S. was competing with the British for influence along the Central American Mosquito Coast, also Belize. The British exported more and better products, had a bigger navy, and much more investments in Latin America and parts of Central America. There was a need, in order to expand to the Pacific, there was a need for a canal, for a quick transport for Navy from Atlantic to Pacific. There were three options. Tehuantepec, which crossed Mexico, 130 miles, Lake Nicaragua, 188 miles, or Panama, 47 miles. The slaveholding south of the United States saw Nicaragua as an opportunity to bring in another slave state if they could incorporate Nicaragua into the United States as a state, and that would tilt the Congress towards slavery. So here are the three possible routes for a canal: across Mexico, across Nicaragua, or across Panama. This brings us to the era of filibusterers. Basically, they were adventuring mercenaries who were trying to carve out territories in Latin America to extend U.S. influence or to set up their own personal fiefdoms. Narciso Lopez was a Venezuelan general who offered to take over Cuba and attempted to do so, to present it to the United States. William Walker was a adventurer who first started out in Baja California, and with 45 men he attempted to overthrow Mexico. However, they ran out of supplies, and they had strong resistance from the Mexican government, forced Walker to retreat back to the United States. So in 1854, Walker was invited by the Liberal Party, which had just lost a civil war in Nicaragua, to lead a revolution in Nicaragua, or a coup. He sailed to Nicaragua from San Francisco with 60 men, and he was reinforced in Nicaragua by 170 locals and 100 Americans. So these were filibusterers. I don't know whether to recommend this movie. Walker is pretty weird. It was made in the 1990s, actually late 1980s, I think. I don't remember the actor's name right now, but it was a critique of the wars in Central America during the Reagan era, as well as the interference with Nicaragua in the 1850s. President Franklin Pierce, not one of our better presidents, a Northern Democrat, recognized William Walker's regime as the legitimate government of Nicaragua in 1856. The Democratic platform endorsed Walker in his efforts to take Nicaragua. In 1857, James Buchanan condemned the lawless expeditions under these filibusterers and mercenaries, Cornelius Vanderbilt's transit company was somewhat involved. They controlled some boat traffic across Lake Nicaragua, and he preferred the Nicaraguan route. It would be more financially beneficial for him, so he provided financial backing to the filibusters in exchange for Walker seizing some property. In 1857, Walker attempted to invade Costa Rica. It was a bridge too far. El Salvador and Honduras joined up with one another to invade Nicaragua. Walker had his back to the wall, and he sought support from the southern states by recasting his campaign as a fight to spread the institution of slavery, black slavery. In December 1856, in Grenada, Nicaragua, Walker was surrounded by 4,000 Honduran, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan troops, and he was expelled from the country. When he attempted to return to Nicaragua twice more, the second time he was captured by the British Royal Navy, who were determined to get rid of him, so they turned him over to the Honduran authorities, who had him shot. End of problem. He's buried in Trujillo. The Gadsden Purchase was another expansion of U.S. territory by purchasing some land along the Mexican border. This smoothed out the U.S.-Mexican border in a straight line. Before that, the border had run along the Gila or the Gila River and then over to the Rio Grande. But with the Gadsden Purchase, they developed a straight line and were able to build a railroad through there. Under the Franklin Pierce administration, there was a big scandal with the Ostend Manifesto in 1854. President Pierce had authorized secret negotiations by his ministers, U.S. ministers to Great Britain, France, and Spain. They met in Belgium to secretly negotiate an agreement in which they would discuss a plan to acquire Cuba by force to prevent England or France from getting it. Congress was preparing to admit two new free states, Minnesota and Oregon. Mississippi Senator Brown said, "I want Cuba, and I know that sooner or later we must have it. I want Tamaulipas, Potosi, and one or two other Mexican states. I want them all for the same reason, for the planting or spreading of slavery," said Mississippi Senator Brown. Pierre Solé, who was the U.S. Minister to Spain, allowed the Ostend Manifesto, to become public. Leaking anonymous sources created a public firestorm and backlash, which caused President Franklin Pierce to back off of this plan. Senators Davis and Slidell in 1859 initiated a bill to provide the president with $30 million to make a down payment for Cuba. And the quote from Senator John Thompson is, "The fruit is now ripe. Shall we gather it, or shall we permit it to remain on the stem until it decays, under the delusive hope that it may fall into our lap without a struggle? No, I propose we shall take it now," said Senator John Thompson. He also said, "I do not want to see our Anglo-Saxon race, I do not want to see our American tribe mingled up with that sort of evil communication." Speaking of allowing a number of Hispanics into the United States. So you can see there was some very blatant racism in the 19th century. And you can also see that Cuba didn't accidentally fall into the U.S.'s hands as a result of the Spanish-American War, but that there had been plans for 60 years before that to acquire Cuba for a variety of reasons. Around this time, there was a French intervention in Mexico, 1862. It was a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, but of course, the United States was unable to do anything because the U.S. was involved in its own civil war. And so it was up to the Mexicans to fight off French troops under Archduke Maximilian I, who was attempting to become the Emperor of Mexico. They actually defeated the French troops the first time around. Later on, that it was not so clear cut, but it was on the 5th of May. I think it was 1862, the 5th of May, which gives us our new celebration in the United States, which we drink lots of Corona or Dos Equis, called Cinco de Mayo. The Cuban War of Independence. Oh, by the way, Maximilian was executed after Napoleon III withdrew the French troops at the end of the Civil War. The Cuban War of Independence began in 1868 and lasted for 10 years. It's known as the 10 Years' War. It was led by the sugar planter Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. He was a large, wealthy farmer, sugar grower, a slave owner. He actually released his slaves at the beginning of the declaration of the Cuban War of Independence because they knew they'd never be able to defeat the Spanish as long as they tried to maintain the institution of slavery. Generals Maximo Gomez and an Afro-Cuban General Antonio Maceo joined this fight along with Céspedes. The rebels took the eastern side of the island, but they could not defeat the Spaniards who held the wealthier western side. In fact, at one point, the Spanish dug a ditch all the way across Cuba, in the middle of Cuba, to defend against the Mambis, as the rebels were known. Jose Marti was 15 years old. He wrote a letter or an essay supporting the independence for Cuba and was arrested and sent to prison in Spain as a result. The Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was under the threat of invasion from Haiti, and so they sent a request to Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, asking to be allowed to join the United States as a new state. Grant was favorable, but it was defeated in the Senate. Then there was some problems in Chile. The War of the Pacific during the War of the Pacific, Chile went to war with Bolivia and Peru over the Atacama Desert. The Chile had a long-standing relationship with British merchants, and there was a presumption of British complicity in the war. But the involvement of the United States was a whole tragic comedy of errors, one mistake after another. There was a cable communication from Chile and Peru, which first had to go to Argentina, then it crossed the South Atlantic to France, and finally back across the North Atlantic to the United States. So the communications were very daunting and complicated. Instructions from Washington were cabled to the end of the line in Panama and then sent by boat to Chile. So you can see how miscommunication could happen. At the same time, the U.S. minister to Chile was extremely anti-Catholic. The envoy to Peru discussed the possibility of annexing Peru to the United States and making it a U.S. colony. There was a scandal of conflict of interest. President Garfield died and was replaced by Chester Arthur, who then replaced the Secretary of State, so that it was by 1883, after 4 years of bungling diplomacy, the United States had managed to alienate both sides of the conflict. And this is a very important moment in history, was the publishing of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890 by Captain Alfred Thayer Mahone. Captain Mahone did research and wrote a book in which his thesis was that there's never been a successful empire without a navy, and a global empire requires a global navy. And so he was proposing that if the United States wanted to become a global player, it had to develop a global navy or a two-ocean navy that could dominate the Atlantic and the Pacific. This book was read by Theodore Roosevelt, for one, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I'm going to skip over the Chilean Civil War of 1891, but once again there was a number of unfortunate miscommunications and unfortunate incidents which led to strained relationships between Chile and the United States. We're going to skip over that for the sake of time. Then there was another incident in Venezuela, which began around 1876, but it came to a head around 1895, in which there was a dispute between British Guyana, and Venezuela over its border. The Great Britain also refused to make territorial concessions. Venezuela owed Great Britain money, so Great Britain was getting ready to send ships and force Venezuela to pay. And so Venezuela appealed to Grover Cleveland and asked him and his administration to adjudicate or to protect them under the Monroe Doctrine. And so that's Grover Cleveland, who actually was one of the better presidents in terms of foreign relations with Latin America. Here's a picture of the border dispute between Guyana and Venezuela, which, by the way, if I remember correctly, it's still unresolved even today. And so tensions arose between the United States and Great Britain over this issue in Venezuela. Great Britain initially told the U.S. to mind its own business, but the U.S. persisted. The British had problems in southern Africa, which was competing for its attention. So they finally backed off and decided to accept Washington's position about the Monroe Doctrine and allow the United States to look after great British interests in Venezuela. So it acquiesced, and this was a major step forward for the United States in its power. And here we have Alfred Thayer Mahan, the influence of sea power in history. And so what do you need if you need a global navy or a two-ocean navy? If you have a navy that's operating in the Atlantic and the Pacific, what's the first thing you need? You need a way to be able to move that navy from one ocean to the other quickly. In other words, the Panama Canal, or the Nicaraguan Canal, or the Tehuantepec Canal. The global navy required navy bases. You have to have ports of call where you can refuel and provide resources for your navy. Where are some of the best locations strategically? Well, one would be in Cuba, guarding the entrance to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico from the Atlantic, and that would be Guantanamo Navy Base. Another one would be in Hawaii, giving access to Asia, Pearl Harbor. The only problem was Hawaii didn't belong to the United States at this time. Another one might be in the Philippines, Subic Bay, which would give you access to markets in China. So a coup was organized in Hawaii to overthrow the legitimate Queen Liliuokalani, who was a constitutional monarch. She was overthrown by a group of businessmen living in Hawaii with help from John Stevens, the American minister. It was approved by President Benjamin Harrison. However, by the time the Marines were landed in Hawaii, shortly after Grover Cleveland was inaugurated as president, he repudiated Stevens and the rebellion and investigated Stevens for inappropriate conduct. Quick note, 100 years later, Bill Clinton went to Hawaii and apologized for our part in overthrowing their constitutional monarch. One of the situations in which I would agree with President Clinton. In 1898, besides the Spanish-American War, we had the election of William McKinley, and he gave the green light to annex Hawaii into the United States as a new state. And so we finally, this is William McKinley, we got our Navy base in Pearl Harbor. This is the Queen who was overthrown. So that brings us up to 1900. Next time we'll talk about the Spanish-American War. Obviously a very important person in that is Teddy Roosevelt. And we'll talk about the corner that the U.S. turns from being a second-rate or third-rate power to becoming at least the first steps with the Spanish-American War, the first steps towards being a world player. All right. Talk to you next week. Take care.